theories of evolution. Many European Christians in the ancient time believed that the earth and all the species created by God about 6,000 years ago. But in the mid 1700s, George Buffon challenged this idea and he suggested that the earth was much older than this and organisms had changed over time in response to environmental pressures and random events. In the 19th century, another scientist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, developed a theory of transformation or Lamarckism. In this theory, he proposed that a mechanism by which the gradual change in species might occur. Just 50 years later, in 1858, Charles Darwin published another theory, the theory of natural selection. Let us study Lamarckism or theory of transformation. Lamarckism, also known as Lamarckian inheritance, is the notion that an organism can pass on to its offspring physical characteristics that the parent organism acquired through use or disuse during its lifetime. It is also called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. The idea is named after French zoologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck in 1744 to 1829, who incorporated the classical era theory of soft inheritance into his theory of evolution as a supplement to his concept of orthogenesis. In 1809, he published a paper which is entitled Philosophie zoologique, which described a two-part mechanism in which change was gradually introduced into a species and passed down through subsequent generations. The two parts of his theory are use and disuse and the inheritance of acquired traits. The first part of the theory of transformation or Lamarckism is use and disuse. This part suggested that by continually using a structure or process or system, that structure or system or process will become enlarged and more developed in advance. Consequently, the structure or process or system that is not used or is little used will become reduced in size or less developed. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck used a classic example to explain the concept of use and disuse. This classic example includes the elongated neck of giraffe, toes of water birds, wings of penguins. So he believed that the elongated neck of giraffe could happen due to straining to reach high branches of trees over a lifetime. But Lamarck could not explain how this might happen since he had no idea about genetics. He only talked about a natural tendency towards perfection, but this is not really an explanation. Concerning toes of water birds, he suggested that from years of straining their toes to swim through water, these birds gained elongated and webbed toes to improve their swimming process. When we see wings of penguins and ostriches to illustrate what might happen to a structure or system or process with disuse. Since penguins and ostriches do not use their wings to fly continuously, their wings would have become smaller than those of other birds and become non-functional to fly. Inheritance of acquired traits. Lamarck believed that traits changed or acquired during an individual's lifetime could be passed on to its offspring. That means all the accusations or losses wrought or had made happen by nature on individuals through the influence of the environment in which their race has long been placed, and hence through the influence of the predominant use or permanent disuse of any organ. All these are preserved and passed by reproduction to the new individuals which arise. He argued that the acquired traits were heritable. He gave us an imagined illustration, the idea that when giraffes stretch their necks to reach leaves high in trees, they would strengthen and gradually lengthen their necks. These giraffes would then have offspring with slightly longer necks. Lamarckian inheritance has since been disproved by the discoveries of genetics. However, Lamarck did believe that evolutionary change takes place gradually and constantly. In essence, a change in the environment brings about change in needs, results in change in behavior, causing change in organ usage and development that bring change in the form over time, and thus the gradual transmutation of the species. He stated that species started out simple and consistently moved towards complexity, or as he termed it, closer to perfection. These ideas are still retained today. Darwinism, or the theory of natural selection. Charles Darwin set out his theory of evolution by natural selection as an explanation for adaptation and speciation. He defined theory of natural selection as the evolvement of a species in terms of survival of those best adapted to a specific environment. After 50 years, in 1858, Charles Darwin published his famous paper on natural selection. Some of Darwin's evidence came from a visit to the Galapagos Islands. These are small groups of islands in Pacific Ocean about 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador in South America. Darwin had visited five of the Galapagos Islands and collected specimens concerning mostly finches. He particularly studied finches found on the different islands. From his data, what he had gathered through the five Galapagos Islands, he noted that there were many similarities between them, as well as there are many obvious differences in between them. From his data, he concluded that an ancestral finch had colonized the islands from the mainland in the absence of predators. Due to the absence of predators, they had been able to adapt to different conditions on the islands. Due to different environmental pressures from these different islands, they eventually evolved into different species. He then suggested that some of the finches had evolved into insect eaters with pointed beaks, and others had evolved into seed eaters with different beaks that were capable of crushing the seeds. 150 years later on, geneticists have been able to confirm Darwin's ideas, and they even produced a family tree based on similarity of their genetic material. As we can see from the diagram, species of ground finches are closely related and species of tree finches closely related with each other. But species of ground finches are distantly related from species of warbler finches. Biologists wanted to test how well the finches were adapted to their niche, They analyzed that the sizes of the seeds eaten by three different ground finches. Although there is a little overlap, each finch eats seeds of a different size and their beaks are adapted to obtain and crush these different sized seeds. As we can see from the diagram, the three most closest species of ground finches, Zoospisa fuliginosa, Zoospisa fortis, Zoospisa magnirostoris, have different sized beaks that are adapted to get and crush different sized seeds from about 1 millimeter to 7 millimeter sized seeds. Zoospisa fuliginosa are adapted or specialized to crush and feed on mostly around 1 millimeter sized seeds, whereas Zoospisa fortis beak are specialized to feed on about 3 millimeter sized seeds, and Zoospisa magnirostris most frequently feed on about 5.5 millimeter sized seeds. Charles Darwin called this descent with modification, and he believed it to be a key evidence in support of his theory of natural selection. We now call this adaptive radiation. The figure shows what proportion of each species ate the different sized seeds. Charles Darwin summarized his observation in two main ideas. The first idea was all species seek or tend to produce more offspring than that can possibly survive, and there is some variation between the offsprings. From his observation, he deduced that there can be a struggle for existence between members of species due to overreproduction and resource limitation. When we say here struggle for existence, it concerns the competition or battle for limited resources that are needed to live or exist on Earth. Some members of a species will be better adapted to their environment, what we call survival of the fittest. The concept of fitness is central to natural selection. In broad terms, individuals that are more fit have better potential for survival. As we said before in well-known phrase, survival of the fittest. Modern evolutionary theory defines fitness not by how long an organism lives, but by how successful it is at reproducing. By combining these two deductions, Darwin proposed that those members of a species which are best adapted to their environment will survive and reproduce in greater numbers than others less well adapted. He called this descent with modification or adaptive radiation. Theory of natural selection can be summarized in the following chart. We know that living things need to over-reproduce exponentially in an environment, but resources are limited or the environment has its own carrying capacity. Due to this reason, there is struggle for existence between members of a species. Since members of the species show variation, those that have features in favor with the environment get selected or have got certain advantages. Those best adapted to the environment survive to reproduce in greater numbers. What we generalized struggle for survival, then lastly, survival of the fittest. Comparison of Lamarck's theory of transformation with Darwin's theory of natural selection. When we see variation aspect of each theory, in case of the theory of transformation, the environment just create a need for the organisms to change themselves. But in case of Darwin's theory of natural selection, there is heritable natural variation among individuals of the group. In survival aspects of each theory, concerning Lamarck's theory of transformation, organisms develop new feature which is in favor with the environment in order to survive. For example, the development of long neck of giraffes and the development of webbed tooth of water birds. In case of Darwin's theory of natural selection, the environment selects those individuals or organisms that have got favorable features with the environment. Among inheritance of each theory, new features acquired during lifetime of an individual are passed on to the next generation concerning Lamarck's theory of transformation. But in case of Darwin's theory of natural selection, individuals with advantageous traits survive in greater numbers and pass on these advantageous traits to their offspring. Eventually, new species occur over time in either theory. Neo-Darwinism. Neo-Darwinism is a modified theory of Darwinism explaining the origin of species on a genetic basis. That means the main driving force of Neo-Darwinism is genetic variation. This theory, which is now accepted by most biologists, combines theory of natural selection, genetic theory, and theories of animal behavior. When we think about how a population might evolve into new species, we need to think in terms of the alleles or all the genes present in the population, what we call gene pool of the population that neo-Darwinism significantly rely on or depends on. The differentiating factor between Darwinism and neo-Darwinism is that Darwinism corresponds to the suitable phenotypic features which can be inherited are the responsible forces for speciation. Neo-Darwinism, on the other hand, relates to the genetic variation only which can be inherited are the responsible forces for speciation. When we see the values of advantageous genes within the population, those individuals with advantageous alleles of the gene will survive to reproduce in greater number, and these advantageous alleles of the gene will pass on to the next generation. The frequency of the advantageous allele in the gene pool of the population will be higher in the next generation without having any doubt. This process repeats over many generations. Mutations are important in introducing variation into populations and could produce an allele which confers a selective advantage. That means when the mutated genes are selected by the environment, it gives survival value for organisms. In this case, the frequency of the allele will increase over time. Second, the mutated genes might be neutral in its overall effect. In this case, the frequency may increase slowly or remain stable or decrease. The change in frequency of that gene will depend on what other genes or alleles are associated with the mutated allele. The third values of mutated genes might be disadvantageous. In this case, the frequency of the allele will be low and could disappear from the population. Did you know about antibiotic resistance bacteria? Mutations in bacteria make them resistant to antibiotics, for example, penicillin and ampicillin. As we can see from the chart, Mutation gives some bacteria in a population resistant to penicillin or any antibiotics. Penicillin resistant bacteria are highly populated or outbreak in an environment where penicillin is widely used. That means resistant types of bacteria have an advantage to survive in this environment. Resistant bacterial strains have a higher survival rate as compared with bacteria which is non-resistant to penicillin because resistant alleles that happen due to mutation passed on in a greater numbers than non-resistant alleles or normal alleles. The increasement of frequency of resistant alleles give a chance for resistant bacteria to flourish or outbreak in this environment, whereas non-resistant types of bacteria or strains become gradually locally extinct in this environment. Neo-Darwinism also encompasses our understanding of animal behavior or ethology. Many ethologists and also evolutionary psychologists believe that not only physical features that can give us an advantage to survive in a given environment, but also behavioral patterns can give us a great survival advantages or values. A behavioral pattern that confers a survival advantage will be selected by the environment, whilst those that do not will be selected against. An example of an advantageous behavior is imprinting in geese. Young geese or goslings imprint upon the first moving object that they see after they are hatching. This is because innate behavior helps them to realize that this will almost certainly be the mother goose that move for the first time around that after they get hatched. There is a very obvious survival advantage in following the goose. The young gosling will be fed and protected due to following the first moving object after they get hatched. Any goslings that do not show this behavioral pattern are much less likely to survive.